Hello. We are in some really exciting times right now. This is the time when neurobiology has shown us the plasticity of the brain and the extreme potential that we have for neurogenesis, or making new brain cells. And yet, this is also a time that we can have excitement in education, because right now we have the Common Core standards that are showing us that we do have a belief in the potential for students. In fact, the way the standards are set up now, we're looking at the idea that all students should be capable of going to college and to be career ready. So the specific skills that are being looked at for those Common Core standards, or the expectations, are things like making sense of problems and persevering, reasoning abstractly and quantitatively, constructing arguments, being able to model, thinking with precision. Now, the interesting thing about the skills that I just shared with you are actually mathematic skills. But the point of this is that that kind of thinking is not only in the domain of mathematics, but goes across the disciplines. In fact, what we're really saying is that the Common Core standards are looking at high levels of thinking and behaviors that students need so they can really belong to the 21st century. So my goal for our work together is to look at this idea of how do we take the potential of all students and move them to the highest level for high intellectual performances. That's what the excitement is really giving us. And yet, the current narrative is quite different. This is the time that, even though we know all of this about the brain, why is it that so many students of color are still underachieving? That's really the question that we're going to look at. We're going to look at it from several objectives. The first objective is to look at an ecological perspective. What is it in the environment and what students are bringing into and taking out of the environment that are holding them back? Such things as prejudice, the idea of social, cultural deprivation, poverty, and stress. And what are those things, how are those things impacting the curricular choices that we're making and the learning process of our children? In this work, what we're going to do is take our ideas of high intellectual performance and present a process for eliciting what we now know is the innate potential of students, but not just for academic success, but for actually allowing them to transform themselves and to transform the world. Isn't that really what we want for our students? Academics is a vehicle, but it is not the end result. We want to look at this whole idea of actualization and contribution. And that has got to start in how students are guided or mediated in schools. So there are some very specific steps that we're going to take in the work that we'll have together our 2 days. First is going to be, how do we in fact identify strengths? How do we engage learning and build on the innate higher order thinking of all of our students? How do we motivate literacy? Not just reading and writing, but literacy across the various disciplines. How do we use strengths to fortify underdeveloped skills? And how do we harness the personal cultural competence of our students so that they know that what they bring into school can be built upon for their own development? And lastly, we're going to look at how do we elicit high intellectual performance for achievement and for their contributions, as I said. So what we're going to be looking at is what I call gifting our students. How do you push them to the frontier of their intelligence? How do you invite them to use that frontier of intelligence to move to higher levels? And how do you get them to feel so confident that they feel that they can not only achieve in school, but to set goals and meet those goals for later in life? So we're going to look at this work through both cognitive and neuroscience. That's going to be the epistemology that we're going to build on. And the kinds of things that we're going to look at are structural cognitive modifiability, cognitive and neurobiological development. We're going to look at the growth mindset, dynamic assessment, and strength-based focusing. In other words, moving away from the old narrative of starting with students' weaknesses to get to the point of starting from their strengths. And how do we develop those strengths? That's where we're going to focus a lot of time on high operational practices. What are those high operational practices that really push students and get to the reflection of cognitive and neuroscience development? The first one is identifying and activating strengths. Then we're going to look at building relationships, nurturing high intellectual performances, providing enrichment, incorporating prerequisites, situating learning in the lives of students, and amplifying their voices. These are practices that have been brought about by studying both the cognitive and the neurosciences, but the application of those into the academic setting. And we're going to focus on that by looking at the kinds of thinking that it can be translated into strategies that then actually show the strengths of the students. Some of those kinds of strategies that we're going to look at that aren't usually used for activating strengths are such things as figurative language and metaphors and similes, the whole idea of poetry and analogies and syllogistic thinking. By using those kinds of strategies, we can actually help students to not only develop language, but to actually exhibit the great strengths that they have. Of course, the next question and the next thing that we're going to focus on in the work is, but how do you bridge this into developing instruction? How do you make lesson plans that are going to incorporate those high operational practices? The kinds of things that we're going to look at is something that we called a pedagogical flow map, where we look at the brain in terms of priming, processing, and retaining for mastery. How do you start with a concept of learning? How do you integrate into that the high levels of thinking? And then how do you make those applications that ready students to take on the kind of text that you need to move them through in any one of the disciplines? The text being not only written text, but also visual text or auditory text, or the text that's the world around them. Then we're going to look at it in terms of processing. How do you help students to process so deeply that their innate skills can be applied, reflected on, and used in terms of the application for retaining for mastery? And once again, looking at those retaining for mastery through higher levels of performance, or what we're calling high intellectual performances. And so I invite you to join us for 2.5 days of very rigorous but exciting and affirming work for you, to remind you of not only the kind of literacy development our students need, but really why you went into this profession to begin with, because you had belief that you had the ability to move students to their highest intellectual performance. We will support that, and we will look at the practices that will get us there.